So, one tip that we would use on farm or get farmers that are cross-fostering to practice is to tag the piglets that they cross-foster. So this here is kind of like eliminating the risk of that pig being cross-fostered for a second time.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Pig Edge, your Teagasc pig podcast with me, Emer McCrum, bringing you all of the latest news, information and advice to keep Irish pig farmers up to date. In this episode, I'm joined by my colleague Louise Clarke to discuss the essential topic of achieving quality weaned pigs. We'll explore the crucial early life factors that impact successful weaning and delve into practical advice on management, nutrition and health, all with a focus on raising strong piglets to improve overall herd productivity.
As advisors, when we go out on farm visits, the farrowing house is one of the main time-consuming parts of that visit. Now, obviously, that is justified because we all know, the farrowing house, it's the engine room of the farm. It's where pigs hit the ground and really that whole life cycle starts. So attention to detail here is going to be critical for, ensuring that strong growth performance and our overall herd profitability. And nowadays everyone talks about the sustainable and efficient production systems. So having a healthy, a well-managed weaned pig is kind of that's going to be more resilient to disease and adapts more efficiently to their post-weaning diets and their new environment. That's where we all want to reach. So really what we're trying to highlight here is, investing time in achieving that kind of quality weaned pig will pay dividends later on. And that's not only from a financial point of view, but also from a labour perspective and for staff morale as well.
Absolutely. And I think, given we have seen changes in the area of post-weaning nutrition of late and that increasing born alive in a lot of units, it's understandable that this is a topical area and a focal point of your visits as well. But before we go any further, and just to frame the context of this discussion, can you give us an idea of the production targets we should have in place, or maybe those key metrics to keep an eye on?
Firstly, I would say, start by setting realistic expectations for the farrowing house. So ask yourself what you want to achieve and obviously think about how you're going to get there. So the obvious one is achieving, quality weaned pigs. That has to be our first goal. And in order to do this, we need to aim to rear, at least 13 or more piglets per sow. A second goal, and I suppose it kind of feeds into that first one really, is to optimise piglet survival. So, if we look back at the Profit Monitor figures for 2024, pre-weaning mortality came back there at 11%. So having this or a lower, better figure is what we also are trying to achieve. And I suppose lastly on that, obviously not forgetting the sow herself. So, making sure that she has the ability to milk well and that she doesn't lose any body condition is going to be primitive into weaning them high quality pigs.
Okay, perfect. So our targets and our goals are clear. In practical terms then, Louise, where do we start?
I would say the first place to start is literally at the very start. So when the pig is born, ask yourself, what conditions that newborn pig needs and how we're going to go about achieving that environment. So, when you think of that newborn pig, they're born wet, they have a large surface area to their body mass, and they don't have hair to insulate them. And I suppose they've kind of limited energy reserves to produce body heat. So really we're kind of left with an animal that's not overly well equipped to maintain their body heat immediately after birth. So I suppose the key factor that producers can manage here is to minimise that heat loss and to help the piglets kind of quickly regain and kind of steadily increase to their normal body temperature. Because, we know piglets that fail to warm up, they'll tend to become weak, they'll be less competitive and I suppose more vulnerable to starvation. So it's really about creating a warm, a dry, a draft-free environment during farrowing and immediately after it that is critical. So, steps like, using or providing bedding to reduce drafts from beneath the slats, that works really well and it also helps to dry off the piglets. So things like shredded paper works quite well for doing that. Also, you'd see some farmers providing supplementary heat lights during farrowing, and if possible, ideally positioning them towards the rear of the pen. And then I suppose maintaining farrowing house room temperature. So, we're talking about that 22, 24 degrees until the room has farrowed. Providing that, it's completed within 2 to 3 days, and obviously that we're seeing no negative effect on the sow. And then really after that, Emer, for the remainder of the lactation period, it's just, making sure that the heat pads are working correctly, and really tuning into, observing the lie-in positions of the pigs when you enter into the farrowing house. So, we all have a temperature gun, and it's a really good tool to check the temperature that the heat beds are at. But by observing the pigs and observing their lie-in position, it's the pigs that'll tell you if it's at the desired temperature that they want. So then along with heat pads, it's, providing the likes of a creep area, maybe with a lid over it, also helps to develop, I suppose, that microclimate for piglets that kind of keeps them nice and snug for the duration of their stay then in the farrowing house.
Yes, and I think the point you made there, just of tuning yourself into pig lying behaviour, interpreting what that's telling you, it's such an important tool, and really that goes for every section of the farm. And Louise, I'll just bring you back there. You mentioned the limited energy reserves in the neonatal pig, and I suppose that relates to regulation of piglet temperature, but also it's going to bring us on to colostrum. What steps can we take just to ensure we're optimising intakes of colostrum in the farrowing house?
Yeah, exactly. Emer, it's optimizing that colostrum intake in the newborn. That is really critical for their survival, their immunity, and their growth. And it is really as early as 3 hours after birth that that piglet can only absorb about 50% of the antibodies that are in the colostrum. And really the capacity of piglets to absorb antibodies then declines quite rapidly after that 6 hours. And obviously it's kind of greatly reduced by the 24 hours. So we are kind of racing against the clock with this one. So I suppose the first thing we want to do is to make sure that there is immediate access to the sow's teeth. So, piglets should start nursing within the first hour after birth to receive obviously the maximum amount of colostrum. So it's important that we make sure, that the sow is comfortable and calm, as obviously a relaxed sow, she's more likely to allow the piglets to nurse more freely. So things like ensuring that the sow or the gilt, that she's in the correct size crate, and that she can lie comfortably, needs to be looked at and should be assessed for each individual sow. Also then Pater Lawler, he would have produced work in the last number of years, showing the benefits of using pain relief for sows after farrowing for both, the sow and the piglet. So we know that if a sow is in pain, she's obviously going to be restless, she's going to be reluctant to lie down, she may even try avoid nursing. So pain relief will kind of help, relax her, keep her calm, and allow her piglets to suckle more frequently and maybe for longer periods as well. And then it also does, I suppose, encourage better milk letdown as well, because pain and stress can interfere with hormonal signals, especially oxytocin, which controls milk letdown. So by reducing pain will help, ensure that kind of steady flow of milk, which will obviously support the early growth and the immune function that we're aiming for in pigs. So some farms will give pain relief, I suppose, as a standard, but then other farms might just give it to gilts. But either way, there is benefits from, I suppose, adapting such practice. And if there is farms, maybe that's not routinely carrying out this practice, but that they're interested in starting to do so, I would encourage them just to maybe speak to their vet to discuss the best options that are available there.
Yes, a really important point. I'm aware of several farms providing pain relief post-farrowing, and they have reported very positive results from doing so. And now, Louise, to move on, assuming we have taken care of the sow, we're happy with her, what do we need to look out for next in terms of piglet care?
Yeah, so look, if you're happy that you've adequate heat for the piglet and that the sow has been provided with pain relief, she's comfortable, she's relaxed, she's willing to let the piglet suckle, it's really focusing your attention to the piglets that need, I suppose, that little bit more TLC. So I suppose, assist kind of weaker or smaller piglets by maybe helping them to find the teat and to stimulate suckling if they're struggling to compete with, their stronger litter mates. And then if necessary, maybe directly supply colostrum to them piglets that are nursing that well. So some farmers will split suckle the litter, and I suppose if you are doing this, it is just important to make sure that you remove the piglets that have received colostrum and have full bellies. So it's not just always the biggest pig in the litter. You want to make sure that you're, I suppose, separating the piglets that have already received colostrum and have full bellies, as opposed to just the big animals that, while they might be big, they mightn't just yet have received their colostrum. And if you are doing this as well, just make sure that when you do split suckle the litter or the piglets that you're separating from the sow, that you don't leave this too long. So, you are kind of talking about that hour max time period there.
Perfect, yes. And the split suckling, I suppose it's often advised for larger litters, and we are seeing the continued trend upwards in terms of born alive. Nationally, that figure reached 15.33 last year. So managing these litters clearly demands more attention. Louise, what strategies or techniques are available to effectively handle larger litters?
So I suppose one practice that a lot of farmers will use, and I suppose the immediate aftermath of farrowing, is cross-fostering, which obviously helps to balance litter size. So this practice can work quite well if it's done properly. So the first step here is that farmers really need to assess the rearing capacity of each sow, and that's going to be based on the number of exposed functional teat. So, the number of piglets on each sow obviously should not exceed the number of exposed healthy functional teat. And in doing this, we need to select sows, with longer, slender teeth, especially if the piglets that we're going to foster are small. So having the correct number of piglets on each sow is actually more important than matching the piglets by weight, because piglets will fight to establish a teat order, and that order is going to remain for the entire lactation. And even though, nursing bouts can go on for several minutes, but milk letdown will only actually be about 10 to 30 seconds. So it's really important that the piglets can get to the teat when the milk letdown happens. And obviously, if there's more piglets than there is functional teat, then that will cause problems. Also, I suppose another few tips with just cross-fostering is to not foster in the first 12 hours. So that the piglets get enough, I suppose, colostrum for their own mother. So it's, I suppose, unlike lactation, when the piglets are born, colostrum is available ad lib. So by leaving the piglets with their own mother, it allows them time to consume as much of this colostrum as possible. But then I suppose also you're trying to have all the cross-fostering completed within maybe the first 24 hours of life. So here we're just trying to minimise the disruption of the piglets and to reduce kind of any risk of disease transfer there between piglets as well. So our colleague, Keelan O'Driscoll, has carried out work in the area, and, part of her work identified that the heavier the birth weight of the piglet, so say, above 1.1 kilos, that were cross-fostered, the more it negatively affected weaning weight. So, it just goes to show that there is an effect of cross-fostering, and really we should try to keep it to a minimum, and only move pigs the once. So, one tip that we would use on farm or get farmers that are cross-fostering to practice is to tag the piglets that they cross-foster. So this here is kind of like eliminating the risk of that pig being cross-fostered, for a second time.
Okay, great advice there, Louise, and it's certainly a useful strategy. But I suppose looking at the broader nursing period, even with cross-fostering, in some cases piglet demand ultimately will outstrip the sow's capacity. So what management steps can producers take here?
Nurse sows and then milk supplementation would be the other two practices that are used to kind of ensure that them large litters can be successfully reared. So with nurse sows, they would differ obviously from cross-fostering, because all the piglets are moved from a litter to another sow, or else then extra piglets are taken from different litters and moved to a sow at the same time. So, on farm, we would see both a one-step system here or a multi-step system, and both of them can work quite well. If you are using that multi-step nurse sow, it is useful to identify potential nurse sows and I suppose an intermediate nurse sow the day before you expect to use them. So with the nurse sow, she receives obviously excess newborn piglets, and that sow herself should be a young sow in medium body condition, and that she's nursed her own piglets well, and she's farrowed say anywhere between 4 and 8 days ago. So with this sow, obviously you need to make sure that she does not receive any more piglets than she's given up. And then her piglets should be moved on to an intermediate nurse sow that has nursed for, say, a minimum of 21 days. So the intermediate nurse sow will wean piglets that are, say, 21 to 28 days old, and she'll receive the 4 to 8 day old piglets from the nurse sow. And again, that intermediate nurse sow, she should be in medium body condition and her teat should be accessible to all the piglets. And again, just not forgetting that, she has nursed her own piglets well, and that we're making sure that she doesn't receive any more piglets than she's already given up.
And Louise, you mentioned milk supplementation as well there. Maybe you could just give us the do's and don'ts in relation to that, please.
Yeah, so supplementary milk obviously can be provided through the likes of milk powder, and it's a good solution to supplying, I suppose, piglets with extra nutrients and energy that they may require. However, as the name does suggest, it should be supplied along with the sow's natural milk rather than replacing it. As we all know that, the sow's milk, it's the safest, it's the most nutritious and I suppose effective feed for young pigs. But with milk supplementation, it can be supplied either manually or through an automated system. And we would see, both systems work quite well on farm once, I suppose, the proper procedure is followed. So if we look at, I suppose, manual supply first, we would recommend that, you fill the bowls 2 to 3 times a day, and you work off the principle of little and often rather than oversupplying the milk to the piglets. Now there is, Pacific feeders that are available for supplying milk, but what's most common practice is the use of the turkey and the creep feeders, and they work quite well for that. With them feeders, though, I just would say the positioning of the feeder is important. So, the feeder should be positioned away from corners or from the dunging area. And then obviously you want it beyond the reach of the sow as well. In terms of the automated systems, then obviously each individual farm pen will be fitted with its own drinking cup, and a small amount, I suppose, of fresh milk then will be distributed to that cup when the pig requires it. However, I would say regardless of what system you are using, one of the most important pathways of success with them systems is the hygiene. So the hygiene is absolutely critical in ensuring that we are getting the benefit of them systems. Other points just, I suppose, to consider is to have a supply of good quality fresh water, both for the milk and for the cleaning process. And that obviously you follow, manufacturer guidelines in relation to the temperature, say, of the water. If that's too hot, that can cause nutrient degradation, and that you may possibly lose the benefit of supplying the milk there. Supplementary milk, while it is advantageous, the provision of that milk is an additional cost on the system. And if it's used incorrectly, it can increase costs because we have a high quality and an expensive product. And then, it does require a sufficient labour input if it is misused or mismanaged. So I suppose while it is a really good option out there, just making sure that proper protocol is followed on it is really important.
Absolutely. It is something we see on units, but certainly going back to your point about the hygiene, that really is the golden rule where milk supplementation is concerned. And so, Louise, you mentioned the positioning of trays in the pens, and I think that brings us nicely to the area of creep feeding. So when should we start to introduce creep feed to piglets, and have you any management tips to increase or maximise the intakes?
piglets naturally will start nibbling on solid feed around that 1 to 2 weeks of age or old. So, providing creep feed helps us get that extra nutrients early, and I suppose the solid feed is what helps us stimulate the development of the piglet's digestive system and the gut microbiota as well. So it helps us kind of, I suppose, better prepare the pig for weaning, and it can also help reduce that stress of piglets because they're familiar with the solid feed, so they're more easily able to adapt to that feed after weaning. So it can kind of help reduce, I suppose, that post-weaning growth check. And then going back to managing them large litters that we talked about earlier, creep feeding, it does provide an additional nutrient source and kind of helps supplement the sow's milk in that late lactation. So we would say introducing it anywhere from 7 to 10 days of age is what we'd recommend. And like the milk supplementation, again, it's back to that little and often that works best here. So initially in the first few days, the piglets are not going to consume a lot of that feed at all. So we would encourage people to fill the feeder where you can see about 50% of the tray floor back, I suppose, looking at you when you have it, when you've put in that feed. So, you're really not overdoing it. It's just trying to get the pigs used to it. And then you can add in more feed when you see that the pigs are consuming more as they get older and they're getting more used to it. On that point, just going back again to the position of the feeder, it should be positioned, say, to one side of the sow's head, rather than at the back of the pen or in the middle of the pen. And this does enable the piglet to learn how to eat from their mothers. And we would have seen that simple change in feeder location. It has been shown to increase creep feed consumption and piglet weaning weight as well.
Perfect. Some really useful tips there. And before we move on to weaning itself, we might just stop at this point and go back to focus on the sow for a moment. We're all very aware of the link between milk production and farrowing house intakes. But what should producers realistically be targeting in terms of intakes? Sows, they're incredibly efficient milkers, but they can only work with what they're given. So can you give us an idea of what we need to provide to the modern sow and how we can keep track of this?
Pig producers, they're constantly being told of the importance of that high feed intake in the farrowing house. If you get this right, you have the ability there to achieve high milk yields and weaning weights. But I suppose from being out on farm, we know that it can be a hard thing to achieve all the time. So I suppose the baseline intake targets we would talk about is, say, about 95 megajoules of DE per day for the gilt and about 105 for the sow. If we're talking dry feed terms, I suppose that kind of comes in at about 6.7 kilos a day for the gilt and say about 7.4 for the sow, assuming that the energy density there is at 14.2 megajoules of DE per kilo. So we would really encourage farmers, to check that they are hitting them targets. And I suppose if the lactating sows are wet fed, there's two ways of calculating that. So firstly, they can use the feed curve to calculate by using the feed curve. It will calculate the estimated intake per day. So however, just do be aware that is only an estimate. And then the second way, and I suppose one that a good few farmers are starting to do now, is to actually use the feed valve intake. So this will give you an accurate estimate of what the sow actually eats. So here farmers are zeroing the valves on entry into the farrowing house, and then they take a picture of the feed computer screen when weaned. So they send that image on to us and we use that to benchmark where their intakes actually lie. So if you do that for a few batches, it kind of gives you a really very good accurate estimation of your lactation intakes. So I suppose if you are below targets, look, there's different things you can look at there, maybe the likes of gilt age at service or body condition score, or even, water to feed ratio, or then maybe house temperature management itself. So there are areas you could look at if, you felt that your lactation intakes weren't where you wanted them to be.
Yes, I was just thinking of the phrase as you spoke there, Louise, that we can't manage what we don't measure. Spending that little bit of time calculating the intakes and benchmarking those results, it's a very, very worthwhile exercise. So going back then to the piglet now, Louise, we're approaching weaning, and it's not necessarily something we can change in the morning, but what does weaning age look like nationally, and what is a good target?
Weaning age, it obviously has a massive impact on weaning weight, and obviously ultimately achieving that, that good quality weaned pig. So in Ireland, weaning age would range anywhere between 24 to 34 days. If we looked again at the Profit Monitor figures, it'll show that, the average is 32 days, which has increased over the last number of years. Grows, say, at about maybe 250 to 300 grams per day during that suckling period. So obviously by extending the weaning age to as close to say 30 days as possible, it's obviously in a very effective way of improving weaning weight. So that should kind of allow producers to achieve, that weaning weight of around 7.5 to 8 kilos. But obviously, Emer, like individual factors such, you have genetics there, you have health status, productivity, management, even available farrowing and weaner facilities will obviously each influence the weaning age. And again, they are going to be very unit specific. So for example, like to increase the weaning age for some producers, they may need to like pull back the sow herd a little to have less sows coming in, whereas other producers may need to get extra farrowing accommodation to allow for that weaning age of 30 days. So look, it is very farm specific, but it is an area that producers maybe should revisit when they're trying to achieve, I suppose, that quality wean pig.
Yes, certainly something that can't be changed too easily, but something to consider maybe longer term for those that have a lower weaning age. And just to look at weaning itself next then, we all know it's the most stressful event in the pig's life, but is there anything we can do to ease stress at this critical time and perhaps smooth the transition post-weaning?
Yeah, weaning is, as you said, it's a huge transition in the life of the piglet. So that piglet's going to go through a number of changes, from feed changes to new house environment to new pen mates. And obviously as well, there will be some level of fighting which will occur as the group obviously is trying to establish its pecking order. However, I suppose a stress that can, I suppose, be overcome somewhat is by allowing the piglets to mix in the farrowing room. So a small number of farms have started allowing litters to actually mix with other litters in the farrowing room. So there is advantages to obviously doing this if you can allow the groups that are being weaned to intermingle. So say by leaving the sow in her crate, but allowing the piglets to mingle in their groups that they're going to be weaned into. That can obviously help to reduce the level of fighting post-weaning, and also seems to kind of encourage a greater feed intake as the pigs seem to be heavier at weaning. Another then development that we would see in Europe at the moment is the farrowing sows in rooms and then wean the sow out of the room. So again, at our normal weaning time, but you leave the piglets in the pens, so until really they're ready to go on to finish her feed. So basically, it's effectively that the farrowing room is now the weaner section also. So the aim here is to kind of reduce the stress on the piglets and achieving, I suppose, a better feed performance throughout the lifetime of that piglet. So I know it can sound maybe a little bit far-fetched, but it may be worth considering in, I suppose, future developments on farm, especially where, farrowing pens are being designed for loose lactation in the future. Then I suppose just lastly, maybe I would advise producers where possible, to avoid vaccinating piglets on the day of weaning. And that's to reduce, I suppose, that extra stress on the vulnerable animal. So I haven't obviously discussed piglet vaccination again because it's very farm specific. But just to mention while on the topic, the importance of storing vaccines correctly and, keeping an eye on fridge temperature and making sure that you're using correct needle lengths and remembering then to change, I suppose, the needles frequently between litters. So all them strategies would be quite important as well in terms of weaning the animal.
And Louise, just when you did touch on vaccination there, I might, before we wrap up, just bring in biosecurity. Most, if not all, farrowing and first stage accommodation is operated on an all-in, all-out basis. But have you any additional advice to improve performance in this area?
Yeah, so when we think of the farrowing house, it's a high risk area because obviously we're frequently handling animals. We may be mixing animals at different stages, and obviously there is a high organic load in the farrowing house as well, and I suppose in relation to waste and the likes of birth fluids. So obviously if there's kind of any inadequate biosecurity here, it allows, say, disease to be spread from piglet to sow, from piglet to piglet, from sow to sow, or even potentially, from the farrowing house into the weaner section. So it is an area we need to be careful of. And I suppose a few of the steps we talk about here would be the likes of, the stock person wearing proper PPE. So even when you're handling pigs, making sure you're wearing gloves. As you said, operating that all in, all out system. But in addition to that, making sure that you're thoroughly washing, you're disinfecting, and you're drying them rooms between each batch, and where possible to allow the house to rest actually helps as well to, I suppose, break that disease burden. Then using, separate equipment for each house. So, and cleaning that equipment between litters is also really important as well. Some farms will use foot dips, but just to note that, if you are using them, making sure that they're managed properly and that they don't become a source of infection. So it's really important, to remove any visible dirt before using that foot dip. So things we'd see work quite well would be like having the likes of a boot brush station nearby to kind of scrape off and clean before you're disinfecting. And then just with disinfecting itself, making sure that you're dipping the entire sole and the sides of the boot into the disinfectant, and, that you have followed the manufacturer's instructions in relation to the dilution rate or the contact time. And then after that, Emer, it's really keeping up with regular maintenance is important. So, maintaining the integrity of the farrowing house flooring, making sure that, you're repairing any cracks or leak pipes. And then, over time, replace any kind of old wooden pen divisions with maybe more robust, non-porous, easily cleaned kind of drying equipment there. So that, I suppose, would be some of the basic steps in terms of biosecurity in the farrowing house.
Perfect, Louise. So as expected, we've discussed a lot today. We've plenty covered. So I just want to say thank you for coming on and for sharing your tips and advice around the weaning pig.
No problem at all, Emer. It does probably seem like I've talked about a lot there over the last few questions, but really the majority of farms are already doing most of what we've spoken about. So it's just about making sure it's being done correctly and that all staff are following the protocol. So hopefully that will result at the end of the lactation period that we're getting them high quality weaned pigs, and it'll make life a little bit easier further down the line.
And that's it for this episode of The Pig Edge. A huge thanks to Louise for joining me on the show. Don't forget to listen and follow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to make sure you never miss an episode. I'm Emer McCrum, and thanks for listening.